Hi everyone, welcome to the Engine Out Procedure webinar. My name is Andrea and I build all of our Engine Out procedures. Today I'm going to be going through some of the most common questions that we get at APG on our procedures. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a brief demonstration of the program that we use to build the procedures. If you have questions during the webinar, you can submit them on the right-hand side of the screen, and then we will answer them at the end. So the first question is probably our most common question, which is, does your data meet Terps climb gradients, or what climb gradient are you using? The short answer to this is no. Our data does not specifically take into account Terps climb gradients. This is because Terps climb gradients are based on normal all engines operating conditions, where the data we're providing is based on an emergency one engine inoperative scenario. These are two independent calculations with different obstacle clearance requirements. It's also important to note that Terps climb gradients will often ignore low close-in obstacles that we are taking into account. So even if you can meet the Terps climb gradient with one engine in op, that alone does not guarantee that you're meeting the regulatory obstacle clearance requirements. When there are obstacles that are not being taken into account in the climb gradient, there will be takeoff obstacle notes for the pilot's awareness. So here's an example of what that looks like. But these obstacles are not being included in the Terps climb gradient analysis, where we are including them in our analysis. Here's another picture of those obstacles that they're referring to on the previous slide. You can see that some of them are not even in the obstacle corridor, but some of them, such as this one, is in the obstacle corridor. So it would need to be included in your obstacle analysis. We are providing that for you. So ultimately, there are two calculations being made. At this time, it is the pilot's responsibility to ensure that he is meeting the Terps all engines operating climb gradient, and we are providing you the one engine inoperative climb performance based on the regulations and your aircraft's AFM. The second question I want to talk about today is, when do I exit the procedure? Am I climbing to the MSA, or what is some guidance on that? The answer to this question is that it is ultimately up to the pilot to determine when they are at a safe altitude to exit the procedure. This might be the MSA, but it also might be possible to deviate from the procedure sooner if, for example, a visual return to the airport can be achieved or an approach to an alternate airport can be performed. Ultimately, we don't specify an altitude in the procedures because we don't want to force a crew to remain circling in an emergency situation when that may not be the best course of action. Another common question is, why does the straight out provide better weights than the turn procedure? I thought the whole point of the turn procedure was to maximize weights, right? First of all, I want to mention that while maximizing weights is typically our reason for adding a turn procedure to the database, it's not necessarily the only reason for us to add a procedure. A couple other examples would be when the straight out flies into restricted airspace and a pilot wants to avoid that. Also, just for ease of navigation purposes. So if a customer always flies the same departure, they might want us to mimic that, even if it doesn't provide the best weights. In addition to that, even when a customer does request better weights, we're designing a procedure based on their specific aircraft and the obstacle limiting them. While this often does improve weights for other aircraft that share the same limiting obstacle, we can't guarantee that it will provide better weights for all aircraft at all flap settings in every situation. So if an obstacle limitation is an issue for you, It's always a good idea to check the straight out departure as well as the turn procedure to see which one gives the best weight. The next question is, what if I lose an engine after I've already deviated from the EOP? What do I fly in that situation? The answer to this question is a little more complicated because it really will just depend on the situation. If you've already deviated from our procedure and it's not reasonable to get reestablished on our procedure, we recommend that you continue on your cleared departure or use your own discretion as to what is the best course of action. We do try to mimic published departures as much as possible to avoid this situation, but in order for us to determine if an engine failure after a deviation point is an issue, we would first need to know the performance for all engines operating up to the deviation point. Because all engine operating data is rarely available, we don't really have a great way to analyze this. The data just typically doesn't exist. All of the data we are providing you is based off of losing an engine at V1. So losing an engine further downrange will already put you above what we have modeled in our analysis. When you combine this with the additional adjustments made in the AFM for conservatism, we believe that is sufficient to ensure obstacle clearance. The last question is probably the easiest question to answer, and that is, to what distance am I protected? For our straight out departures, and I should specify that for any procedure that does not include the DP designation, we are evaluating a straight out departure. So for all of those departures, as well as any procedure that does not end in a hold, we're providing obstacle clearance out to 30 nautical miles from the departure end of the runway. If it does end in a hold, obviously we are evaluating obstacles in the holding pattern. So with that, I will go into a brief demonstration of the program that we use to build these procedures. Just a little background. This is a program called EOP Studio. It was built in-house by one of our engineers. So it was built custom to our needs and nobody else has access to this program. I've loaded Eagle, Colorado here. It's one of our most popular and challenging airports. You can see this bluish green line is the runway at Eagle. You can also see some of the nav aids in the area. I'm going to demonstrate how we built 25DP, which is very similar to the gypsum departure. So the gypsum departure starts with an immediate left turn to heading 219. Whenever we have an immediate turn, we try to identify the end of the runway as another reference point for the pilot. So in this case, it's SXW 2.8 DME. So I will choose that nav aid from this drop down, and we're using it as a distance, and that is 2.8. And I'll make sure I have the right runway here. So you can see in the text box here that it starts to auto-generate some text. And you'll see that SXW 2.8 is within 0.1 nautical miles of the departure end of runway, or essentially the end of the runway. So then, instead of heading 219, we use heading 215 because that gives us better weights. And we're going to fly that heading until crossing DBL radial 326, which does match the SID. So I will now choose DBL and crossing radial 326. Then we're going to make a right turn, which we designate as 352 degrees. to intercept DBL, intercept radio 322 outbound. And we're going to take that to curl intersection and identify that as DBL radio 322 with a distance of 21.5. That is where our procedure ends. So it does end earlier than the SID. And then we're going to hold at, we're going to hold at curl on DBL radio 322. So this is kind of a graphical representation of what I just built, and it does very closely resemble the SID. I will then go in, you can see down here, the text that it creates is just kind of a run-on sentence. So I will go in and add in some words and line breaks just so that it makes more sense. It's a little bit more readable. But you can see that I don't actually have to mess with any of the auto-generated text, so that just makes it less likely for me to make mistakes as I'm doing this. So now you can see the text down here looks a little bit more readable. So then our newest feature is the graphical version of the EOP. Again, it's very automated. So that should come up in just a second. So this is what that auto-generated. So then I can just go in here and move some things around to make that a little bit more readable. So it will end up looking something like that. The graphical EOPs are included in our newest product called iPreflight Genesis. And that's pretty much it. So we can go ahead and answer some questions now.